The day Margaret pressed the pen into my hand, her eyes cold and sharp, I felt my chest tighten. She said if I didn't sign, I'd lose Elias, the man I promised to build a life with. My palms were damp as I stared at the papers, words I barely understood swimming in front of me. Elias stood behind her, silent, his jaw tense but his gaze fixed on the floor, as if he couldn't even look at me. I wanted to believe this was just another one of her power plays, that if I gave in, peace would return to our home. Margaret had always made me feel small, mocking my work, my clothes, even the quilt I made with my grandmother's help. She called it a patchwork rag, something unworthy of keeping. Every insult she hurled felt like a stone, and Elias never shielded me from it. He always said, "She's my mom, just let her be." Now here I was, pen shaking in my hand, her voice cutting through me. "Sign it, Caroline. If you love him, you'll do it. Otherwise, maybe you're not the wife he deserves." My heart raced, and I glanced at Elias, waiting for him to defend me, to tell her this was wrong. But he didn't. His silence screamed louder than her words. I signed, my name scratched across the paper, and with it, everything I thought was mine slipped away. Our home, our savings, even the sense of security I once had. Margaret's lips curled in satisfaction, her victory complete. I didn't know then that the only thing she couldn't strip from me, the quilt she laughed at, held more power than I could imagine. It would be the very thing that pulled me back when everything else was gone. From the very beginning, Margaret made it clear she didn't see me as good enough for her son. When Elias and I married, I thought in time she would soften, that maybe once she saw how much I cared for him, she would accept me. Instead, she seemed to grow sharper with every visit. If I mentioned my work, she dismissed it as unimportant. When I shared something I enjoyed, she smirked as if it was childish. Even the quilt I made with my grandmother, something filled with love and history, was mocked as though it was worthless clutter. At first, I tried to brush it off. I thought she would grow tired of picking at me, but she never did. Each dinner, each holiday, each moment she could find, she reminded me that I wasn't her idea of a wife for Elias. What hurt more than her words was Elias's silence. He never defended me, not once. He would squeeze my hand under the table or whisper later, "Don't take it so seriously, that's just how Mom is." I wanted him to stand beside me, but instead, he always leaned toward her. The weight of her disapproval grew heavier with time. I found myself second-guessing my choices, wondering if she was right about me, wondering if maybe I wasn't enough. I tried harder to please her, cooking meals I thought she might like, offering to help around her house, even wearing clothes she once suggested. None of it mattered. She always found something to tear down, and Elias always told me to just let her have her way. It wasn't long before her influence reached deeper into our lives. She started questioning how we managed our money, hinting that Elias should be more careful. She told him stories of couples ruined by gold-digging wives and how smart men protected themselves. I overheard her one night while I was cleaning up after dinner. Her voice carried through the hallway as she spoke to Elias, soft but firm, planting seeds of doubt about me. "You need to think ahead. What if something happened? You worked hard for what you have. You don't want to risk it." When Elias repeated her words to me, I felt something in my stomach drop. He said we needed to make changes, that Margaret was only looking out for us. He talked about estate planning, about protecting the family. The way he framed it sounded reasonable, like it was just a precaution, nothing personal. But I could hear her voice in his tone, guiding him, pressing him. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe this was just about paperwork, about safety. Still, I couldn't ignore the way Margaret looked at me when he explained it. There was a satisfaction in her eyes, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She wanted me boxed in, tied down, powerless. Elias urged me to agree, saying it would make everything easier in the long run. He brushed off my concerns, promising it was nothing but a formality. I felt cornered. Between his pleading and her constant pressure, I could barely breathe. My words didn't matter, my feelings didn't matter. In their eyes, this was already decided. That was when I started to realize I wasn't just fighting for space in their family. I was losing my place in my own marriage. The papers sat on the table like a trap waiting to close. Elias placed them in front of me with a calm voice, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. He said it was simple, just a matter of protecting what was his before we met. He told me not to overthink it, that Margaret only wanted to be sure everything was safe for the future. I asked him why now, why suddenly this mattered, but all he said was, "If you love me, you'll sign. Mom's just protecting the family assets." I stared at the pages, the words swimming in front of me. I didn't understand most of it. Every line felt heavy with hidden meaning, yet Elias brushed past it as if it was nothing. My hands shook as I held the pen, and I told him I wasn't ready, that I needed time to think. His expression hardened. He said I was making this more difficult than it needed to be. He made it sound like my hesitation meant I didn't trust him, like I was the one creating a problem. Margaret stood close by, watching like a hawk. Her presence filled the room. She didn't shout, she didn't raise her voice, but every word she spoke cut through me. It's just paperwork, Caroline. A good wife wouldn't question her husband like this. Why would you hesitate unless you had something to hide? Her lips curled into the faintest smirk, and I felt myself shrinking under her stare. Elias slid the papers closer to me, his hand firm on the edge of the table. Just sign, he said again, quieter this time but sharper. I felt outnumbered. Every reason I tried to voice was brushed aside. Every fear I had was dismissed as foolish. In that moment, it didn't feel like I was sitting across from my husband. It felt like I was standing in front of a wall I couldn't move. My chest tightened, and I thought about what would happen if I refused. I pictured Elias walking away, Margaret convincing him I wasn't loyal, that I wasn't the wife he deserved. The thought of losing him weighed heavier than the fear of what I was giving up. With trembling fingers, I lowered the pen and signed my name. When the last letter was written, Margaret reached forward and slid the papers back toward her, as though she had claimed a prize. She didn't thank me, didn't soften, only looked at me with a glint of triumph. Good choice, she said coldly. Then her gaze fell to the quilt folded on the couch. She let out a short laugh. All you'll ever have is that rag. Her words stung deeper than I expected. That quilt, stitched by my grandmother's hands, held pieces of my childhood, pieces of love she had given me. To Margaret, it was nothing more than scraps. To me, it was the last thing in the house that felt like mine. I wanted to defend it, to defend myself, but the fight had already been pulled from me. I sat there in silence, the sound of the pen still echoing in my ears, realizing that in a single moment I had given away everything I thought was secure. Not long after the papers were signed, Margaret made herself at home in ways I never imagined. What started as her staying for a few weeks to help quickly turned into her moving in completely. She brought her furniture, filled the kitchen with her dishes, and took over the living room like it had always belonged to her. Every day, she gave me orders in my own house, laundry to do, meals to prepare, errands to run. If I sat down for even a moment, she found a way to remind me that I was falling short. Elias didn't push back. In fact, he seemed to welcome it. Whenever I asked if he thought this was too much, he shrugged and said his mother just liked things a certain way. Slowly, he pulled away from me. He stopped sitting next to me at dinner, stopped asking about my day, stopped noticing if I was even in the room. It was as if my presence no longer mattered. He laughed at her jokes, nodded at her opinions, and spent his evenings in conversation with her while I cleared the plates and washed the dishes alone. The space that used to feel like our home now felt like Margaret's kingdom. She walked through the rooms with a kind of ownership, moving things around, tossing out what she didn't like, deciding what belonged and what didn't. I kept quiet, but each time she discarded something of mine, it was like she erased another part of me. The real blow came when I tried to pay a bill and discovered I no longer had access to our accounts. The bank teller looked at me with polite confusion as I fumbled with my card, insisting there must be some mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. My name had been removed, and Elias was now the only one with control. When I confronted him, he brushed me off with a vague explanation about simplifying. He made it sound like it was for my benefit, that I didn't need to worry. But I did worry. Without access to money, I couldn't even buy groceries without asking. If I needed gas in my car, I had to wait until Elias gave me cash, which came with questions about what I planned to do. For the first time in my life, I felt completely powerless. The independence I once had was gone, replaced with dependence on two people who seemed to take pleasure in reminding me of it. Margaret noticed my new position quickly. She would leave bills on the counter and tell me to make sure Elias takes care of this, as though I were just another burden. She asked me to cook for her friends, to polish her silver, to scrub the bathroom before guests arrived. The way she spoke made it clear she saw me as nothing more than a servant under her. Each day I sank a little deeper into silence. I told myself to endure, that maybe if I stayed quiet, things would get better. But deep down, I knew the walls were closing in. I was no longer a wife or a partner. I was an outsider trapped in a house where everything, from the money in the bank to the food on the table, was controlled by someone who despised me. It happened late one evening after another long day of doing everything Margaret demanded. I was sitting quietly in the corner of the living room, too tired to argue, too tired even to speak. The television was on, but I wasn't watching it. I was just staring at the floor, trying to feel invisible. Margaret walked in, looked at me, and laughed softly to herself. Then she said, in a voice sharp enough to cut, "You're nothing. You don't even own this chair you're sitting on." Her words hit harder than I expected. I knew she saw me as beneath her, but hearing it said so plainly, with Elias sitting just a few feet away, made something inside me break. I looked at him, hoping, just once, that he would stand up for me. He didn't. He kept his eyes on the screen, pretending he hadn't heard, pretending that I didn't matter. That silence was worse than her cruelty. It told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't blind to what she was doing. He simply allowed it. In that moment, the truth sank in like a stone in water. I had been clinging to the hope that Elias was trapped between us, that he loved me but didn't know how to stand up to his mother. But that wasn't the truth. He had chosen his side a long time ago, and it wasn't mine. Every cruel word she said, every demand she made, he let it happen. He made excuses for her, covered for her, and left me alone to take it. He wasn't protecting me. He never had. I excused myself and went upstairs, my chest tight and my throat burning. I shut the bedroom door and sat on the bed, trying not to cry too loudly. The room felt less like a safe place and more like a cage. There was nothing in the house that was truly mine anymore. My clothes, my belongings, even the bed I was sitting on, all of it was legally under Elias's name now. I felt stripped of everything that had once given me stability. The only thing I had left was the quilt folded carefully at the foot of the bed. I pulled it into my lap and wrapped it around my shoulders, feeling the soft weight of the fabric. The stitches weren't perfect, some crooked, some uneven, but each one had been made with love. My grandmother's hands had guided mine when I was younger, teaching me patience, teaching me to create something that would last. Every piece of cloth held a memory, a reminder that once someone cared deeply for me. I ran my fingers along the seams, pressing the fabric to my face, breathing in the faint scent of home that still clung to it. For a moment, the chaos faded. The quilt reminded me of who I was before Margaret's voice filled my head with doubt. It reminded me that I was not as small as she wanted me to believe. Hidden inside its folds were little compartments my grandmother had taught me to stitch. They were meant for keepsakes, letters, small treasures, pieces of a life you wanted to carry close. I had never put much inside, but just knowing they were there brought me comfort. In a house where everything else had been taken, the quilt was my last piece of freedom. That night, wrapped in its warmth, I realized I had reached the lowest point. I had lost my husband, my security, and my place in the life I thought I was building. But as I held the quilt close, I also realized something else. I still had a thread of strength left, however thin. And somehow, that thread was enough to keep me from disappearing completely. The quilt had become the only thing that gave me peace. Whenever Margaret's voice grew too sharp or Elias's silence too heavy, I wrapped myself in it. One evening, as I sat on the edge of the bed with the fabric draped across my lap, I noticed one of the seams had started to pull apart. The thread had loosened with time, and a small gap showed where the fabric no longer held tight. I reached for a needle and thread to fix it, the way my grandmother had taught me. The motion was calming, something steady I could control in a world where everything else felt lost. As I pushed the needle through, the tip caught against something firm inside the quilt. At first, I thought it was just a knot or a mistake in the batting. But when I pressed again, I felt the edge of paper. My heart began to race. Carefully, I pulled at the seam, widening it just enough to slide the folded envelope free. It was yellowed with age, the paper soft at the edges. My hands trembled as I opened it, unsure of what I would find. Inside were several documents, neatly folded, and a note written in my grandmother's careful handwriting. The first papers I unfolded were deeds, old property documents with her name printed clearly. Alongside them were savings bonds, tucked away like a secret inheritance. My chest tightened as I realized the value of what I was holding. These weren't scraps of paper. They were security, proof of something solid that belonged to me through her. Then I unfolded the note. The words were simple, but they felt like they were written directly to the moment I was living in. Never let anyone make you small. This quilt carries your future. When the world feels heavy, remember you were made strong. You are not to be broken. I pressed the note to my chest, tears spilling down my face. It was as though my grandmother had known one day I would need this, that she had stitched more than fabric when we made the quilt together. She had stitched a lifeline. All this time, Margaret thought the quilt was nothing but rags. She had mocked it, laughed at me for keeping it close. Yet hidden inside was the one thing she could never take from me. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope. I wasn't trapped in the way she wanted me to believe. These papers, these bonds, they were more than just money or property. They were a way forward, a way out. I folded everything back into the envelope and tucked it deep inside my dresser drawer, my hands still shaking. The quilt now felt different in my arms, heavier with meaning. It wasn't only a reminder of love from the past. It was a key to my future. For so long, I had believed I was powerless. That night, with my grandmother's words echoing in my mind, I realized I still had a choice. I didn't know exactly how, but I knew I would find a way to use what she left me to escape the life Margaret had forced around me. The envelope stayed hidden in my drawer for several days before I found the courage to do anything. Each night, after Margaret went to bed and Elias shut himself in the study, I would unfold the papers and read them again. The numbers on the savings bonds startled me. They weren't just scraps tucked away. They were enough to give me a foundation. enough to stand on my own if I dared to step away. One morning, when Margaret insisted I drive across town for her errands, I took a detour instead. My hands were clammy on the wheel as I parked in front of a small law office I'd noticed before but never thought I'd need. The sign read Dalton and Associates. I walked inside with the envelope clutched to my chest, praying I wasn't making a mistake. Mr. Dalton was older, calm, with silver hair and a voice that didn't rush me. I explained everything slowly, my words halting, but he listened carefully. I showed him the bonds and deeds, and for the first time in months, I saw a flicker of relief cross my own face when he nodded. "These are valuable," he said. "You could start fresh with what's here. It's not millions, but it's enough to give you freedom." Then I told him about the papers I had signed for Elias, the ones Margaret pushed on me. My voice shook as I described the pressure, the threats, the way I felt cornered. Mr. Dalton leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "A contract signed under that kind of pressure can be challenged," he explained. "It may not hold in court, especially if we can show you were manipulated. The law takes duress seriously." Those words lit something inside me. I hadn't realized until then that what they did might not just be cruel. It might not even be legal. Mr. Dalton handed me a small notebook and told me to start keeping track of everything. Dates, times, words spoken, how they treat you. "Document it all," he instructed. "It will matter." So I did. I began writing in secret, careful to hide the notebook where Margaret would never find it. Each insult, each task she forced on me, each time Elias looked the other way, I wrote it down. The pages filled quickly. What once felt like endless suffering now became evidence. With every word I recorded, I felt less like a victim and more like someone quietly gathering strength. At home, nothing seemed different on the surface. I still cooked their meals, cleaned the rooms, and kept my head down. Margaret believed she had broken me, and Elias acted as though my silence was agreement. But inside, I carried the weight of a plan. They thought they owned everything, yet tucked away in my drawer was proof that I still had a future waiting. Each night, when I held the quilt across my lap, I no longer felt only comfort. I felt resolve. My grandmother had stitched more than fabric together. She had stitched hope into my hand. Now, with Mr. Dalton's guidance, I knew what I had to do. The first step had been taken. The rest would come quietly, patiently, until the day I could finally walk away. The night of the dinner party, the house buzzed with voices and clinking glasses. Margaret had invited her friends, women who looked at me with polite smiles but curious eyes, as though they already knew what she thought of me. I spent the day preparing the meal, setting the table, polishing every surface while she barked instructions over my shoulder. By the time the guests arrived, I was worn thin, but I forced myself to smile and serve as if I belonged. I moved quietly around the table, refilling glasses, bringing out dishes, clearing plates. It was my house once, yet that night it felt like I was no more than hired help. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her voice carrying above the laughter, her glass raised as though she were queen of the room. She thrived on the attention, and soon she turned it toward me. With a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes, she said, "Caroline here does her best, bless her heart. Though really, she doesn't contribute much. Elias and I keep everything running. Without us, she wouldn't have a roof over her head. She's more like, well, a parasite than a partner." The laughter that followed was low and uneasy, but no one challenged her. Heat rushed to my face, and I stood frozen with a tray in my hand. I looked toward Elias, begging silently for him to speak, to tell her she had gone too far. But he didn't. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoided my eyes, and let the moment pass. I swallowed hard and excused myself to the kitchen, where I gripped the counter until my knuckles turned white. The humiliation burned, but underneath it was something colder, sharper. I realized this wasn't just cruelty anymore. This was the end. When the guests finally left and the house grew quiet, I went upstairs, hoping Elias might finally see what had been done. Instead, he came into the room with a look I recognized too well, defeat mixed with distance. He didn't sit beside me, didn't reach for my hand. He just said softly, "Mom thinks it's time you leave." The words hung in the air. For a moment, I thought I might break apart, but instead, a strange calm settled over me. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply nodded, stood up, and began to pack. There was nothing left to fight for. I moved quietly through the room, folding my clothes into a small bag. I didn't take much, only what I needed, only what was mine. The last thing I picked up was the quilt, folding it carefully and tucking it under my arm. Margaret had mocked it countless times, but it was the one piece of home that had never turned against me. I didn't look back when I walked down the stairs, past the dining room where the table still held traces of the night. I didn't look back at Elias, who stood in the hallway, saying nothing, offering nothing. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and with that sound, I knew I was done. For the first time in months, the air outside felt light in my lungs. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew I was free of that house. And for the first time, freedom felt possible. The first night in my small apartment felt strange, but it was mine. The walls were bare, the furniture simple, and the bed creaked when I lay down. But for the first time in a long while, I could breathe without waiting for someone's voice to cut me down. The funds hidden in the quilt gave me just enough to pay rent and buy the basics. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Each morning I woke up knowing I didn't have to answer to Margaret's demands or Elias's silence. That alone gave me strength. I kept meeting with Mr. Dalton, bringing him the notebook filled with dates, words, and moments I had written down in secret. He read carefully, nodding as he went through each page. He told me this was more than just cruelty. It was a clear pattern of control and manipulation. Combined with the way they forced me to sign away everything, it painted a picture that was hard to ignore. When the case finally went to court, I felt nervous walking into the room, but I wasn't alone anymore. Mr. Dalton stood beside me, calm and steady. Across the aisle, Elias sat stiffly in his suit, Margaret at his side with her lips pressed tight. She glared at me as if I had no right to be there, as if I had betrayed them. In truth, it was the other way around. Mr. Dalton laid everything out clearly. He explained how the documents had been pushed on me, how I was told to sign or risk losing my marriage. He showed the court my notes, page after page of insults, isolation, and financial control. He reminded them that a contract signed under pressure is not binding. His words were careful, but they carried weight. When it was my turn to speak, my hands trembled, but I told the truth. I explained how I had been silenced in my own home, how I had been left with nothing but a quilt and the memories stitched into it. I spoke of the fear I felt, but also of the strength I found in deciding to leave. For once, my voice wasn't drowned out. Margaret tried to interrupt, her temper breaking through the calm of the courtroom. She called me dramatic, a liar, ungrateful. The judge warned her to stay quiet, but she couldn't hold back her anger. Her words only made her look smaller, more vicious. Elias sat slouched beside her, not defending me, not defending himself. He looked like a man stripped of power, unable to hide behind his mother's shadow. When the judge gave the ruling, I felt my knees weaken. The contract was invalid. The forced signature meant nothing, and I was entitled to a fair share of the assets from the marriage. It wasn't about money for me. It was about being seen, about having the truth recognized. Margaret's face twisted with rage, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Elias stared down at his lap, unable to meet my eyes. I walked out of that courtroom with my head high, knowing I had won not just in legal terms, but in reclaiming myself. They had tried to take everything, but I had taken back my voice, my dignity, and my future. Months passed, and the quiet of my new home became a comfort. It was a modest place, nothing grand, but every corner belonged to me. I chose the curtains, the dishes, the books on the shelf. For the first time in years, I could move about freely without waiting for someone's disapproving glance or sharp remark. The peace was something I had almost forgotten how to feel. One evening, after a long day of work, I curled up on the couch with a cup of tea. The quilt rested across the back of the chair, waiting for me like an old friend. I pulled it around my shoulders and felt its weight settle over me. The fabric was worn, the edges a little frayed, but it carried the warmth of every stitch my grandmother had taught me to make. As I sat there, I thought about the path that quilt had carried me through. It wasn't just cloth. It was nights of comfort when I felt invisible, the secret that gave me the courage to leave, and the reminder that I came from strength greater than Margaret's cruelty or Elias's weakness. My grandmother hadn't known the life I would face, yet she had left me exactly what I needed to survive it. The house was quiet, but my mind wandered back to the courtroom, to the look on Margaret's face when the judge ruled against her. I remembered Elias shrinking beside her, no longer the man I once thought I loved. They had both expected me to crumble, to walk away empty. Instead, they were the ones left to stew in their bitterness, chained to each other in a house that would never again be mine. I no longer thought about them with anger. That time had passed. What remained now was clarity. I had survived their cruelty, and I had come out stronger because of it. Their power over me was gone, and all they had left was the hollow satisfaction of controlling a space where I no longer lived. The quilt reminded me of everything I had reclaimed. It held the past, yes, but it also carried me into the future. When I touched the seams, I felt not just fabric, but love stitched into every line, patience folded into every corner. It was a part of me, a part that no one could ever take. I closed my eyes and let the warmth sink in. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't small. I wasn't trapped. I was free, living a life I had chosen for myself, guided by the quiet strength that had always been mine. The memories of Margaret's insults and Elias's silence no longer weighed me down. They had tried to strip me of everything, to leave me with nothing but despair. Yet the very thing they mocked, the quilt they dismissed as worthless, had carried me here. to safety, to peace, to a future I could finally claim as my own. They thought they stripped me of everything, but the quilt they mocked carried me into the life I deserved.